Everyone in the hall started laughing the moment she walked on stage with a broken violin in her hands. And for a few seconds, it was hard to tell if this was a music competition or a cruel joke, because the sound of laughter was louder than any melody that had been played before that day. And yet she stood there frozen for a moment, clutching the violin like it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. Her name was Lena, a shy girl from a small town where everyone knew everyone, and that was both a blessing and a curse. The stage lights were bright and hot, and they made her eyes blink again and again, but she kept her chin up, trying to hide the fear crawling inside her heart. The crowd was whispering, already saying things like, "What is she doing with that broken thing?" or "This will be funny, just watch her." And Lena could hear every single word, even though she tried not to, because the microphone picked up more than just her footsteps. It picked up their laughter too, and it echoed across the hall like little knives. She looked at the judges sitting behind their shiny table with their pens and papers and important faces, and even they exchanged small looks like they already knew what was coming. One of them leaned back in his chair with a tiny smile that said, "This is going to be a disaster." Another just sighed and tapped his pen on the table slowly, waiting for the moment to start. But Lena did not move yet. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly, and whispered something so quietly that no one could hear it except maybe the old violin in her hands. She said, "For you, Mama." That was the only thing that kept her from running off stage. That one little whisper that reminded her why she was there. She did not come to win a prize. She did not come to prove anything to anyone. She came for her mother, who once loved music more than anything in the world, before life took that love away from her. Lena felt the wooden body of the violin pressed against her chest. It was rough and full of scratches, and there was a long crack running down its side. But to her it was beautiful, because it was the same violin her mother had played years ago when everything was still fine. She raised the bow, but before it even touched the string, someone in the audience laughed again, louder this time, and said, "Does that thing even work?" And others joined in with giggles and whispers, and a few people even pulled out their phones trying to record what they thought would be a funny performance. Lena's hands trembled harder, and for a second she almost believed them. Maybe it was silly. Maybe she really should not be here. Maybe they were all right. But then she remembered how her mother's eyes used to shine whenever she played, how her mother said music is not about the instrument, it is about the heart behind it, and that gave Lena strength to keep standing. Her fingers touched the strings softly, testing the sound, but it came out weak and broken like the violin itself, and that made the audience laugh again. But Lena did not stop. She adjusted the peg, twisted it gently, and tried once more. This time the sound was a bit clearer. Still not perfect, but enough to make her believe it could work. And even that small note seemed to hold a secret promise inside it. A whisper that said, "Wait. Something is coming. Something none of them expect." She looked up at the crowd and saw faces full of amusement and disbelief. Some people were shaking their heads, others were covering their mouths, pretending to hide their laughter. But she saw one face in the corner, an old man sitting quietly, not laughing, just watching her with a soft expression, and that gave her courage. He nodded once, almost like telling her to go on, and she knew she could not quit now. The stage felt bigger than it really was. Every step she took felt heavy, like she was walking through thick air, but she placed the violin under her chin and held the bow with both hands. And even though her heart was racing and her eyes were full of fear, there was also a tiny spark of fire deep inside her chest, one that refused to die. She closed her eyes and imagined her mother sitting in the front row smiling at her, the way she used to when Lena was just a little girl practicing at home, and suddenly, all the noise around her began to fade. The laughter turned into a dull echo somewhere far away. She could barely hear it anymore. And in that quiet, she could almost hear her mother's voice saying, "Play, my little star, just play." And she smiled, a small, shy smile that no one could see because her head was bowed, and the light caught her hair like a halo. The crowd was waiting, half amused, half curious, wondering if she would really play or just stand there frozen. They did not know that this girl with the broken violin had spent every night for months practicing in her small room with cracked walls and a flickering bulb. She had played through pain and loneliness. She had played through tears and silence. She had learned to make beauty out of brokenness, and tonight she was ready to show them all. The host whispered from the side of the stage, "Ready when you are." And Lena nodded slowly, still not opening. Her eyes, she took one last deep breath, her fingers steady now, her bow rising like a bird about to take flight. And the audience leaned forward, expecting the worst, but having no idea what they were about to hear. And in that breathless moment between laughter and music, between doubt and courage, the hall went silent, waiting for the first note that would change everything forever. That broken violin once played the most beautiful music in town, and people still remembered those days when the sound of Amelia's violin floated through the air like magic and filled every corner of the streets with peace and joy. And even the birds seemed to pause to listen because her music had something special, something pure that touched every heart that heard it. And for a long time everyone said no one could play like Amelia, because when she played it felt like the world stopped for a moment and just breathed with her. Lena was only 6 when she first heard her mother play, and she remembered sitting on the floor watching in silence as the bow moved like a feather across the strings, and her mother's face glowed under the soft yellow light of their little living room. She had never seen anything so beautiful, and in that moment, Lena fell in love with the violin the same way her mother once had. But life had other plans, and sometimes dreams shatter even before you know how to protect them. It happened on a rainy evening when the streets were slippery and the clouds were heavy with thunder. Amelia was returning home after a performance she had been invited to play for the mayor's celebration, and the hall had been full of people who stood up and cheered for her music. But on her way back, a car came speeding down the wet road, and everything changed in a single moment. There was the sound of tires, the scream of metal, the flash of rain, and then silence. Amelia survived, but her right hand was badly hurt. She could no longer move her fingers the way she used to, and the doctor said she might never play again, and the violin that had been in the case that night was cracked right down the middle when she saw it. She cried, not because of the pain in her hand, but because of the pain in her heart. Her music, her dream, everything she loved was now broken, and she placed the violin in the attic wrapped in an old blanket, hoping to forget it, but deep down she never truly could. Years passed, and little Lena grew older. She still remembered her mother's music, even though the house had become quiet since that day. Her mother tried to smile, but it never reached her eyes anymore. The violin lessons stopped. The laughter stopped. And the house that once sang now only whispered with the sound of the wind against the windows. One day when Lena was about 10, she went exploring in the attic while her mother was at work. She found old boxes filled with books, pictures, and a dusty blanket tucked in a corner. When she pulled it open, there it was, the same violin she had seen. Her mother hold so long ago, cracked and faded, but still beautiful. She touched it gently, afraid it might fall apart. But when her fingers brushed the strings, a faint sound came out, soft and trembling, like a small whisper. It was weak, but it was there, and something inside her heart lit up that very second. She decided she would fix it. Somehow she did not have tools or money, but she had hope, and that was enough. She cleaned it slowly every day using an old cloth she borrowed from the kitchen, and she tightened the strings one by one until the violin could make a small melody again. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. When Amelia came home one night and heard that sound, she froze in the doorway. At first she thought she was dreaming, the sound of a violin in her house again. After all those years, she climbed the attic stairs and found Lena sitting there holding the old violin, awkwardly trying to copy what she remembered. Her mother once did. The bow was crooked and the notes were rough. But the look on Lena's face was pure joy. Amelia's eyes filled with tears. She wanted to tell her to stop because the violin was too fragile, and her heart was too full of old wounds, but she couldn't. She just stood there watching her daughter play. From that night, everything changed. Little by little, music began to return to their home. Amelia started teaching Lena, even though her own hand couldn't hold the bow anymore. She guided her with words, with memories, with love. She taught her how to feel the music instead of just playing it. And Lena listened carefully every night after dinner. They would sit together, the mother humming the notes, the daughter practicing again and again, until the stars appeared outside the window and the world was quiet except for the sound of that broken violin trying to sing again. As months passed, Lena's skill grew. Her notes became clearer, her bow stronger. She played for the birds in the morning, for the trees in the backyard, or her mother at night, and sometimes for herself. When the world felt heavy, the neighbors began to notice too. They would pause outside their windows to listen. They whispered that the little girl with the broken violin was playing just like her mother once did, and some even said maybe even better. But Lena didn't care about that. She just wanted her mother to smile again. And every time she saw that smile return, even for a moment, she knew she was doing something right. But inside Amelia's heart there was fear too. She knew how cruel the world could be. She knew people could laugh at what they didn't understand. And she worried that one day Lena might face the same pain she once felt when her dream was taken away. So she warned her, gently saying, "Remember, my dear, it's not about how others see you, it's about what you give to the music." And Lena nodded. Even though she didn't fully understand those words yet, she would soon. Because the day was coming when she would have to stand alone on that stage with nothing but that broken violin and the strength her mother gave her. And in that moment, all the laughter and all the doubt in the world would not be enough to silence the song she carried inside her. The morning sun touched the small window of Lena's room and filled it with golden light. And for a moment, everything felt warm and peaceful. But deep inside her heart, something was heavy, because today she had made a big decision, one that could change everything. The town's music competition had been announced and the posters were hanging all over the market square. Everyone was talking about it, how the best young musicians from different schools would be there, how the winner would get a scholarship to the City Music Academy, and how it was the biggest event of the year. And when Lena saw the poster for the first time, her heart skipped a beat. She wanted to join. She wanted to stand on that stage and make her mother proud. But when she told her, Mother Amelia's smile faded for a moment, not because she didn't believe in her daughter, but because she remembered how cruel people could be. Amelia said softly, "Are you sure, my love, that you want to do this with that old violin? The judges may not understand, they may laugh." And Lena smiled a small, brave smile and said, "I don't care if they laugh, I just want to play." And her mother looked at her for a long time before nodding slowly, because she saw something in her daughter's eyes, something she herself once had long ago. From that day, Lena practiced harder than ever before. She woke up early every morning to tune the violin. Even though one of the strings buzzed and another creaked, she played until her fingers ached and the bow's hair began to fray. She didn't have a teacher from the academy or fancy lessons, but she had something better. She had her mother sitting beside her, guiding her with words, and humming the tunes softly, correcting her when she slipped, and cheering when she improved. Every note they played together built a new memory over the old broken ones, and soon their little house was once again full of music. But outside, things were not so kind at school. When Lena mentioned that she would be performing in the competition, her classmates laughed. One boy said, "With that broken thing, seriously?" Another girl rolled her eyes and said, "It's not even a real instrument. It's just trash." And the laughter spread through the hallway like wildfire. Lena stood there clutching her violin case, trying not to cry. She wanted to shout that they were wrong, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she walked away quietly, her heart sinking heavier with each step. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window holding her violin, looking at the stars and wondering if she had made a mistake. Maybe they were right. Maybe she didn't belong on that stage. Maybe the violin was too old and too weak. But then she remembered her mother's words. Again, music is not about the instrument, it is about the heart behind it. And slowly her doubt began to fade. She took the violin and started to play softly. The notes floated through the night air, and even though her eyes were full of tears, her hands didn't stop. Her mother heard the sound from her room and came quietly to the door. She didn't say anything, she just watched Lena play. And when the last note faded, she whispered, "You remind me of myself when I was your age, but stronger." Lena smiled weakly and said, "I'm scared, Mama. What if they laugh at me again?" And Amelia sat beside her and said, "Let them laugh. Laughter fades, music stays." And those words sank deep into Lena's soul. She didn't realize it, but that night was the moment she truly became an artist, not because she played perfectly, but because she chose to keep playing even when she was afraid. The days passed quickly and the competition day drew closer. Lena practiced in every free moment at school. She would find an empty classroom and rehearse quietly while others played outside. Sometimes she imagined the audience. Sometimes she imagined the judges. And sometimes She imagined her mother sitting in the front row cheering for her, and that thought always gave her courage. Still, the fear was always there, whispering, "What if you fail? What if they laugh? What if the violin breaks?" But she refused to listen to that voice. She focused only on the music. Finally, the morning of the competition arrived. The air was cold and the sky was pale with clouds. Her mother helped her braid her hair and handed her the small violin case like it was a treasure. Amelia kissed her forehead and said, "No matter what happens, I am already proud of you," and those words stayed with Lena as she walked through the town square toward the big hall where the competition was held. The sound of people talking and instruments tuning filled the air, and her heart pounded like a drum inside her chest. Backstage, the other performers had shiny violins and polished shoes and elegant clothes. Lena looked down at her simple dress and her worn shoes, and for a moment she felt small, invisible. She heard whispers from a group of girls nearby. "Isn't that the one with the broken violin?" Oh dear, this will be fun to watch, and the sound of their giggles burned in her ears. But she held her violin tighter and took a deep breath. Her mother's words echoing again. Laughter fades, music stays. She repeated it again, and again until her heartbeat slowed and her hands steadied. Then the announcer called her name, next contestant Lena from Greenwood School, and the lights dimmed. The crowd clapped politely, not knowing what to expect. She walked out onto the stage, the same stage that would soon witness something unforgettable. The same stage where laughter would turn into silence, where doubt would turn into wonder. She stood there small but strong, holding the violin that carried her mother's dreams and her own. And as she took her place under the bright light, she whispered once more, "For you, Mama," before raising her bow and letting the world wait for the sound of her courage. The lights in the hall dimmed, and the air felt heavy like 1,000 eyes were staring at her, waiting for something to happen. Lena stood at the center of the stage, her fingers shaking slightly as she held the broken violin close to her chest. She could hear the whispers from the audience rising like a quiet storm spreading. Through the rows, someone laughed softly. Another whispered, "This is going to be funny." And the sound of those words cut through her heart like tiny needles. But she didn't move. She just stood still, breathing slowly, feeling the rough wood of the violin beneath her hand. Her eyes searched the crowd for one face, and when she saw her mother sitting in the back row smiling with tears in her eyes, something inside her began to calm down. The noise of the people faded. The lights no longer blinded her. All she could hear was the echo of her heartbeat and the memory of her mother's voice telling her, "Just play, my little star, just play." And so she lifted the bow, her hands still trembling but her spirit slowly growing stronger. The first note came out soft and uneven, almost a whisper of sound, and a few people in the crowd chuckled. One man muttered under his breath, "She can't even tune it right." But Lena didn't stop. She pressed her fingers harder, and the second note followed, clearer and smoother this time, and then came another and another until the laughter began to fade. The music started to grow like a small flame, finding its strength in the darkness. Each stroke of the bow carried a piece of her story, the pain of her mother's lost dream, the nights of practice under the flickering light, the tears that fell quietly when no one was watching. And as she played, her eyes closed, she wasn't standing on a stage anymore. She was in her small living room with her mother humming softly beside her, and the walls of the hall disappeared, replaced by the warmth of those memories. The audience could feel it too. Something in the air had changed. The melody climbed higher, flowing through the hall like a gentle river, and the broken violin no longer sounded broken. It sang, it cried, it spoke in a voice so real that people forgot they were listening to an instrument. They were listening to her heart. A woman in the second row wiped her eyes. A boy near the back stopped whispering and leaned forward. The judges exchanged glances, whispering quietly to one another, but none of them could look away. Every note told a story of struggle and love and courage, and even though the violin was cracked, it carried the sound perfectly, as if it had been waiting all these years for this moment. Lena felt her fear melt away. Her hands moved freely now. Her bow danced across the strings, and the music filled every corner of the hall until there was nothing left but sound and silence and feeling. She moved with the rhythm like she was part of the music itself, her hair falling around her face. Her eyes closed, her heart open every time she drew the bow across the strings. The sound grew more powerful. It was as if the broken violin had come alive, reborn in her hands. The audience sat still, unable to move, unable to breathe, afraid that even the smallest noise might break the spell she had cast. For the first time in her life, Lena felt completely free. She forgot about the laughter, the doubt, the fear. All that mattered was the music flowing through her veins. She thought of her mother and imagined her smiling, proud and full of love. She thought of the nights she spent alone practicing when her fingers bled and her eyes burned with tears. She thought of how every person in this room had once laughed at her and now they were silent, listening to her story through the sound of her violin. The song reached its middle and she played faster, her movements stronger, the bow flying across the strings with passion and fire, and it felt like the whole room was moving with her. When she finally slowed down, the music softened again, falling like gentle rain, touching every heart that heard it. The hall was filled with emotion. No one could explain. Some people closed their eyes. Others held their breath, afraid to miss a single note. And then something happened. One of the strings snapped with a sharp sound and gasps echoed through the hall. Lena froze for a second, her heart racing, but then she remembered her mother's words again. Music is not about perfection, it is about heart. She smiled, took a deep breath and continued playing with the remaining strings, turning the broken sound into something even more beautiful. The audience couldn't believe what they were hearing. How could someone turn a mistake into magic? As she played the final few notes, her body moved with the rhythm, like she was dancing her bow, gliding gently until the last note floated in the air. Long and pure and trembling with emotion, it hung there for a moment like the world itself was holding its breath, and then there was silence. For a few seconds no one moved, no one clapped, no one spoke. They just sat there, eyes wide, hearts full, as the sound slowly faded into the stillness of the hall. Lena stood on the stage, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, her eyes glistening with tears. She looked out at the crowd, not sure what would happen next, and then a sound broke the silence. A single clap from somewhere in the middle row, then another and another, until the entire hall was filled with applause. Loud, thunderous applause. People stood up from their seats, clapping, cheering, shouting her name, some even crying, and for the first time Lena smiled, a bright, honest smile. She looked at her mother, who was crying too, but with pride, not sadness. And at that moment, Lena knew she had done something that no laughter could ever erase. The sound of clapping filled the hall like thunder, echoing off the walls and bouncing back to the stage, where Lena stood frozen for a moment, unable to believe what was happening. Her heart raced, her hands trembled, and she could feel the tears rising in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of fear. They were tears of something pure, something she had never felt before. Joy, pride, relief, all mixed together. She looked down at her violin, its cracked body shining under the stage lights, and whispered softly, "You did it, Mama, we did it." The audience continued to cheer louder and louder. Some people shouted her name, others just stood silently with their hands together in awe, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might break the magic that still floated in the air. The judges were whispering to each other, shaking their heads, not in disapproval but in disbelief. One of them had his hand over his mouth, and the woman beside him wiped her eyes quickly, pretending not to cry. The music that had come from that broken violin had reached a place beyond sound. It had reached their hearts. Lena looked around the hall, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The same people who had laughed at her before were now standing, their faces filled with emotion. The boy who had whispered, "This will be funny," was now clapping the loudest. Even the girl who had mocked her violin had tears running down her cheeks. Lena smiled, a small, shy smile, because she realized something in that moment. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about showing them the truth that beauty could come from broken things. The host came onto the stage, his voice shaky with excitement. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, please give another round of applause for this brave young girl." And the crowd responded. With even louder cheering, Lena bowed her head gently, and then looked toward the back of the hall where her mother was standing, her eyes shining like stars. Amelia's hands were clasped together over her heart, and tears streamed down her face. She mouthed the words, "I'm proud of you," and Lena felt warmth spread through her chest, stronger than anything she had ever known. As the applause began to fade, the hall grew quiet again. The judges stood, and one of them stepped forward. His shoes clicking softly against the floor, he said, "Young lady, would you mind staying on stage for a moment?" Lena nodded, her heart beating so fast she could hardly breathe. The judge walked up to her and smiled kindly. He said, "What you did tonight was more than music. It was a story and we all heard it. But may I ask something? Where did you learn to play like that?" And Lena hesitated for a second before answering softly, "My mother taught me. She used to be a violinist before her hand was hurt. She taught me everything I know." The judge nodded slowly, clearly moved by her words. He looked down at the violin in her hands and asked, "And this instrument, it looks quite old and worn. Where did you get it?" And Lena's voice trembled as she said, "This was my mother's violin. It broke in an accident years ago, but I couldn't let it go, so I fixed it the best I could, and it's the only one I have." Her words were simple, but they carried so much weight that the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. For a moment then the judge whispered quietly, almost to himself, "Sometimes broken things have the strongest voice." The audience clapped again, softer this time, not with excitement but with respect, the kind of applause that came from the heart. Lena looked around and saw faces shining with emotion. Strangers smiling at her children, whispering to their parents, old people nodding slowly as if they understood what she had done. It felt unreal, like a dream she never wanted to end. She lifted the violin once more and played a short, soft melody as a thank you to the crowd. It was gentle and sweet like a lullaby, and the sound floated through the hall like a warm breeze, wrapping everyone in peace. Her mother walked up the aisle toward the stage. People moved aside for her, their eyes following as she climbed the steps slowly. When she reached Lena, she didn't say anything. She just hugged her tightly, and in that hug was every word she didn't need to speak. The audience began clapping. Again, this time even louder. Some people stood on their seats waving their hands. Others shouted bravo. The hall that had once laughed was now filled with love and admiration, and for the first time in years, Amelia's smile returned completely bright. And full. Lena pulled back from the hug and looked at her mother's face and said quietly, "I played for you, Mama. I wanted them to know your music isn't gone." And Amelia replied, "My little star, your music is my music, and tonight the world heard it." Together they turned to face the audience and bowed side by side. The light shimmered around them like golden dust floating in the air. When the competition ended later that night, Lena didn't care about the results. She didn't care about trophies or scores. She already had what she came for as they walked home under the pale moonlight, her mother holding her hand and the violin case in the other. Lena could still hear the echo of the applause in her ears. She looked up at the stars and whispered thank you to the sky, and her mother squeezed her hand gently as if to say, "I heard it too." The streets were quiet, and the wind carried the faintest hum of her final note, a note that seemed to live forever somewhere in the night. And in that moment, Lena understood something deep and true, that music born from love never fades, that even a broken violin can sing louder than the proudest voice, and that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from the pieces we refuse to give up on. The next morning, the sun rose gently over the small town, painting the streets in soft gold, and the sound of birds singing filled the air. The night before still felt like a dream to Lena. She could hardly believe what had happened. Her heart was still full of music, and the memory of all those people standing and clapping for her played again and again in her mind. She held the violin in her hands and traced her fingers along the cracks that ran through its body. Those lines, that once looked like scars, now looked like proof of strength. She smiled quietly, whispering, "Thank you again and again." Her mother was sitting at the kitchen table sipping tea, her eyes tired but bright. When Lena walked in, Amelia looked up and said, "Good morning, my little star," and Lena ran into her arms, hugging her tightly. Neither of them spoke for a while. They just sat together, listening to the quiet morning. Amelia finally said, "Your father would have been so proud of you," and those words made Lena's chest tighten. She didn't remember much about him, only that he used to sit by the window while her mother played, and he always said that music made their small home feel bigger, warmer, alive. After breakfast, there was a knock at the door, and when Amelia opened it, she gasped. Standing there were two of the judges from the competition, one man and one woman, both holding envelopes in their hands. The man smiled kindly and said, "We hope it's not too early. We wanted to visit you and your daughter, if that's all right." Amelia invited them in, and Lena stood shyly beside her violin, still resting in her arms. The woman spoke first, saying, "We couldn't stop thinking about what happened last night. It wasn't just a performance, it was something more."